The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for attending our cell tower tracking webinar. My name is Nathan Swaim. I'm the president of ANRC, and one of our goals this year was to increase public awareness into all the research we've been doing in cybersecurity and forensics. So next month, we'll be hosting a malware webinar, doing best practices in reverse engineering, some really technically dense topics around the latest and greatest malware threats that are out there. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff or future stuff around this kind of stuff, then let us know. We'll get you added to the mailing list so you're aware of what we're offering. The goal of this webinar is to create awareness about cell tower tracking and more importantly, how it's an underutilized evidential source for mobile investigations. Our target audience this evening is mobile forensics analysts or forensics examiners. So before we get started, just a little bit about our company. If you haven't heard of ANRC, we're an advanced cybersecurity training, consulting, and solutions provider. And our part in this is to provide training for the books that these guys have written, a really well-written book on cell tower tracking, plus much other topics. So we will be providing the training after the book gets rolled out, which it sounds like it already has. So look to us if you have more questions or you'd like some short 1-2 day sessions on any of these topics. Our speaker today is Joe Hoy, and Joe is a mobile forensics examiner and an expert witness in the UK. His company is called Forensic Analytics, and they've developed some really cool tools to aid in court cases and investigations, some of which has changed the tides in high-profile cases in the United Kingdom. So I think you'll be very interested in his experience. I know you'll be entertained by his war stories at the end of the webinar and the high-profile cases that they've made history with. And you should know that they've released a book on cell tower tracking, now available through Amazon. Sold out really quickly already, and the publisher's been getting caught up with the demand. So you should check that book out as well. Some general guidelines for the webinar. We can't hear you, obviously, so I'll be monitoring the chat window as well as the question and answer window here. So if you have any questions, you can post them in there. We'll try to get to them, but time is short. So if we don't get to them, we'll definitely follow up with you on email after the webinar. So rest assured, any questions you ask will be recorded and then we'll get back to you. Additionally, you'll have a chance to download the slides. You can also download them now. If you look in the chat window, I've posted the link there. So we'll send those to you after the webinar, as well as the recorded video of this presentation. So if you want to share that with someone else, you'll have the ability to. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Joe and let him get started. Go ahead and take it away, Joe.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. Evening, everybody. Joe here, Joe Hoy from Forensic Analytics. And what we'd like to do this evening is spend the rest of this hour providing some overview of cell site analysis, as we call it, or cell tower tracking, as it's sometimes known over in the US. Provide our perspective on this evidential tool, and maybe introduce you, if you're already familiar with cell site analysis, maybe introduce you to some techniques that possibly don't get used that often in the US, but which we find to be a crucial part of our evidential arsenal over here in Europe. I'll tell you a little bit about me and our company before I start. My name's Joe, as I said. My background is engineering. I've been a telecoms engineer for longer than I care to remember, getting on for 30 years now, I guess. And I've worked for several fixed line and cell phone companies. I've also worked as a trainer quite extensively, training on telecoms and cellular topics. I spent the last 4 or 5 years concentrating on LTE 4G networks, but in that time I've also worked as a cell site expert witness and a cell site analyst. So I've done this work. I've done radio surveys, I've written forensic reports, taken them to court and presented them in evidence many times. And I'm also a member of the UK Forensic Regulators Cell Site Working Group, where we're trying to put some regulatory framework, that's difficult to say at this time of night, around this area of cell site analysis. Our company, Forensic Analytics, as Nathan said, is primarily involved in producing software that automates some of the aspects of cell site analysis, and if we've got time at the end of the session, I'll tell you a little bit about our software and our training products as well. So our agenda for this brief webinar on cell site analysis is, for those of you that aren't familiar with it as an evidential technique, I'll give you a brief technical overview of what cell site analysis is, where the data that we use comes from, and what we can use it to prove, or at least to support in evidence in investigations and court cases. Once we've looked at the technical basis for this, we'll take a quick run through of what we see anyway from our perspective as being the differences between the way that we do things over here and the way that you guys do things for cell tower tracking over in the US. I'll also, as Nathan mentioned, include some war stories. So we've got 3 main case studies that I'll mention. One is one of my cases that I took to court. One is one of my colleague Martin's cases, who's sitting in on the session as well. And sandwiched in between those two, there's what's probably one of the most infamous cell site related cases that we have over here. Really quite horrible scenario, but cell site evidence proved quite crucial in making a breakthrough in that case, and also in securing a conviction in it. So we'll talk about some of those aspects as we go along. And finally, at the end, I'll do a quick summary of what we've discussed. I'll do some blatant plugging of our software and our training services, and then we'll wrap up and finish. So let's talk about cell site analysis. What is cell site analysis? From our point of view, cell site analysis is a forensic evidential technique which attempts to provide evidence of where a cell phone may have been when certain calls were made. Now you'll notice there's some weasel words in there, attempts and may have been. One of the things that hopefully I'll impress upon you during this session is that cell site analysis isn't an exact science. You can't, in most cases, say exactly where a cell phone was when it was used from the billing record. And in most cases, you can't say that a place that you're saying a phone could have been at is the only place it could have been at. What generally this provides is supporting evidence that supports the contention that a phone was at a certain location. But I'll fill in some of the ideas around this as we go along. Let's look at some of the basics of this technique first. Cellular networks are formed from hundreds, or in the case of a country the size of the US, thousands or tens of thousands of overlapping radio cells. Each radio cell is generated by a cell tower, which might actually be a tower, or it could be on top of a high building, or it could be strapped to a lamppost or a power pole, or all sorts of places that cell tower equipment can be mounted. Each cell tower produces an area of radio coverage known as a radio cell, hence the term cellular network. The overlapping coverage from cell to cell provides a patchwork of radio coverage across the region or the area or the country being served by a particular network. So you can see in the diagram on the screen here that we've got a sequence of cell towers across a mixed area. So the green background here shows a rural area, and the orangey kind of background here shows a more urban or suburban area. The size of the cells that are generated by the cell towers can be controlled simply, in most cases, by turning up or turning down the power of the transmitter. So you can control the size of the cell, and the cell size is normally tailored to the level of population that it's going to cover. So out in very rural areas where there are few potential subscribers, the power of the tower, if I can put it like that, is wound up, so you end up with great big cells covering large amounts of area. As you move into more populated areas, the power is turned down and you get progressively smaller and smaller cells, smaller coverage areas, as you move into more and more populated areas. And the reason we do this is that each cell has a limited amount of capacity. So if you can only serve a limited number of subscribers per cell, and you're in an urban area, then you're going to want lots of very small cells to provide you with lots of coverage. Every cell in each network has its own unique cell ID, so you can identify each cell separately based on information that the cell transmits. Now, we've shown lots of nice round circles here. It would be great if every cell covered a nice neat area with a well-defined boundary around it. Well, actually, no, that probably wouldn't be so great, because if cell coverage actually looked like this, then there'd be no job for us, because it'd all be very predictable and easy to discover. In reality, as we'll see in a couple of slides' time, actual cell coverage is a lot messier than this. The signals from a tower can get blocked by geography, can get blocked by big buildings, can compete for coverage with neighbouring cell towers. So the area covered by a cell tower is generally unpredictable, but is also eminently measurable and discoverable. Now, one further thing about this very basic diagram, again, we've shown these cells as nice, neat circles. In reality, most cells are segmented into what we call sectors. So each sector is generated by a different radio antenna pointing in a different direction. So you end up around most cell towers with separate sectors, separate areas of radio coverage. So in reality, this sector would have its own identity, this sector would have a different identity, and this sector would have a different identity again. The key to cell site analysis is the fact that, firstly, each cell has its own defined cell ID, and secondly, when a cell phone call is made, the network captures details of the cell or the cells that were used for that call in the billing record. So if you go to a cell phone company and request the billing record for a particular mobile subscriber, as well as getting details of each call that was made, the time and date of that call, the called and calling parties for that call, the duration for the call, you also get details of the cells that were used to carry that call. Now, this is crucial information because each cell only covers a limited geographical area. Knowing the cell ID, and then by extension being able to find out where the cell tower that carries that, it gives you the ability to localize the area in which the phone must have been located when that call was made. Typically, a billing record that contains cell site information will contain at the very least the start cell, the ID of the cell that was used at the start of a call. If the user is mobile when they make the call, or if they're in an area of overlap between two cells when they're making a call, it's perfectly possible for the network to perform what we call a handover, and what you guys over in the States tend to call a handoff, from one cell to another. So it could be that a call begins in this cell here, the user drives off down a highway, and the call ends on a cell over here somewhere, having been handed off between different cell towers during the call. Typically, as I say, the billing record contains at least the start cell that was used at the beginning of the call. Many formats of billing data also contain details of the end cell that was used at the end of the call, and I've recently seen some examples of AT&T data that also contain details of cells that were used in between, so handover cells that were used during the call as well. What this information allows us to do then, as I say, is to localize where the phone must have been when the call was made. So if you've got start cell information in a billing record, the phone must have been somewhere within the coverage of that cell and that cell tower at the start of the call. So this is useful information. It means that it's possible to, for example, support or cast doubt on someone's alibi. So if you've got a suspect in a case, you put it to them that they were involved in a particular crime or incident, and the crime took place in New York, and their alibi is, no, I was in Albuquerque on that afternoon. If you look at their billing record, and their billing record is full of cells that have got New York zip codes, then that begins to cast significant doubt on the alibi that was put forward. So even at the level of just knowing what tower was used and what cell was used for a call gives you the ability to put some kind of geographical framework around the evidence that's being presented. What we do, and what I believe is a less commonly employed technique in the US, we typically go a stage further than this. Just knowing where a cell tower is, just knowing what direction the sector, the cell that was used, points in, gives us a degree of useful information, but isn't necessarily proof that the person using the phone could have been at a particular incident or location. So what we tend to do in the UK and in lots of other jurisdictions as well is add to the billing record information with forensic radio survey information. Now, in a forensic radio survey, we'd go and visit a site, we'd go and tour an area using forensic radio survey equipment. And what forensic radio survey kit essentially does is acts like a standard cell phone. So standard cell phones are taking measurements of the set of radio channels they can see, the set of cells they can detect all the time. And a standard cell phone is simply choosing the strongest signal, the strongest cell from moment to moment to be served by. Forensic radio survey equipment acts like a standard cell phone, so it takes those measurements, but instead of just forgetting them, not storing them like a cell phone would do, forensic radio survey equipment keeps a log of the measurements that have been detected. This means that you can play that log back and see, for example, the set of cells that provided a signal at a particular location, and which of those cells were the strongest, and therefore which of those cells phones would choose to use if they were asked to make a call from that location. So the diagram presents a scenario in which a forensic radio survey would be employed. An incident has taken place at this location. We've gone off and got the billing record for our suspect, and the billing record indicates that at the time of the incident, or maybe just before the incident, our suspect was using cell ID 12347, the cell ID of the network that their phone was connected to. If we want to prove that that phone could have been at that location at that time, we can go to the location, do a forensic radio survey, and hopefully find that the cell ID we're interested in, 12347, is the serving cell at that location. So this means we can go beyond saying that the phone could have been anywhere within the coverage of that cell to saying specifically the phone could have been at that location. Now, this isn't proof that the phone was at the location, but it's stronger supporting evidence to back up the contention that it was. Now, we've been running these webinars for, this is the second time we've done it. We did some last month, and we're doing some this month. And we've also, as Nathan said, got a book on cell site analysis that's recently been published. And I've had several conversations recently with cell site practitioners in the US. And the question I get asked most often during those conversations is, how have you guys in the UK turned cell tower tracking into an accepted scientific discipline? How have you turned it into something that doesn't immediately get dismissed by the judge for having no scientific basis? And my answer is, because we back things up with radio surveys. Without a radio survey, it's supposition, it's educated supposition, but the radio survey that proves that a particular cell provides coverage at an alleged location becomes empirical proof that the phone could have been used there, rather than wishful thinking that it might have been used there. Now, I don't mean to impugn the way that cell site investigations take place in other jurisdictions. All I'm really trying to point out is that the addition of this extra step, this forensic radio survey step, turns it into empirical evidence that can be presented to a jury. So location surveys, which is what's depicted on this slide, is one way of gaining cell site evidence. What a forensic radio survey does is provides details of the set of cells that provide coverage at or around a location, and also provide the average signal strength of those cells, so you can tell which cells phones are likely to choose to use were they to be used there. You can go further and make test calls as well. So make a set of test calls and see what cell the phone uses to connect to the network at the location. So location surveys are one very powerful technique that we can employ. Another one is called a cell coverage survey. Now, going back to what I said earlier on, the fact that the billing record contains a cell ID shows that a phone must have been somewhere within the coverage area of a cell when that call was made. As unfortunately, real life cells don't project coverage areas in nice neat circles. If we want to be able to quantify what that coverage area is, quantify what the area within which the phone must have been is, we can go out and take a coverage survey. Now, these are quite time consuming and quite expensive in manpower terms to undertake, but again, they provide very compelling evidence in certain circumstances. So what you're seeing on the screen here is the map representation of a drive survey that we undertook in relation to a case. This is a real map from one of my old cases, actually. So in this case, our radio surveyor, drove all the streets in this part of this city. So this line of yellow dots indicates the route that was driven, and at each of these yellow dots, the radio survey equipment captured a measurement of the radio environment. The survey equipment's also got a GPS receiver on it, so we can align the readings to the map by placing the dots at the point where the GPS fix was taken. The yellow dots indicate the routes that was driven. The red dots indicate points at which our target cell here that we're interested in was the serving cell. Now, the serving cell is the cell a phone would use if it was at that location, the strongest cell at that location. And you can see that in real life, far from providing a nice neat circle around the cell tower, which is over here, the coverage is actually much more chaotic. So we've got a core area of coverage, which is where we'd expect this cell to cover. And you can see these arms here indicate the direction that this sector antenna is pointing in. But you can also see that we've got areas of what we can call non-contiguous serving coverage scattered all over the town, over other parts of the town. In between, these other areas are served by other towers. So there might be a tower here, and a tower here, and a tower over here, and so on. So going back to what I was saying earlier on, the coverage of a cell isn't a nice neat circle, partly because of geography, and partly because of competition from other neighbouring cells. Now, in this specific example, you can see this cell is located in a city called Bradford, which is up in the north of England. And Bradford itself is located in a bowl. It's like a bowl-shaped valley. And it turns out that this cell tower is up on one lip of the bowl, then it drops down into the town itself, and then these areas of non-contiguous coverage around here are on the opposite lip of the bowl. So this particular cell tower, this base station, is really firing its signal across pure line of sight to these areas that are directly in line of that signal, whereas everywhere below that, down in the bowl, is covered by more local signals. Now, in this particular case, it was beneficial that we'd undertaken this coverage survey, and that's partly why I chose this map as an illustration, because our suspect had used a cell at a point maybe 5 minutes before an incident occurred that they were accused of. And the incident occurred on the other side of town, over here, and our suspect's alibi was somewhere over here, number 1 here. So number 1 was our suspect's alibi location. Number 2 was the crime scene, the incident location. Now, if we'd just gone by expectation we'd have expected this cell tower to only cover an area pretty much where the core coverage is shown here. We could not have guessed or predicted these areas of non-contiguous coverage. And it's lucky we did do this drive survey, because you can see just under the number 2 here, a little patch of non-contiguous serving coverage from our cell that proved that it was possible for our suspect to have been at the crime scene at about the time that the crime took place. It also proved that it's fairly unlikely that they could have been at the alibi location, because you can see there's no coverage from that cell near the alibi location. So, adding the forensic radio survey to the cell site analysis techniques pays dividends. In terms of radio surveys then, we've got 3 main techniques that we tend to use. Location surveys, providing details of the set of cells that provide coverage at a given location. Cell coverage surveys, providing details of the footprint area covered by a particular cell or cell tower. And we also quite often do what we call route or scenario surveys. So say you've got evidence that the getaway car used in a bank raid drove down a particular street or drove a particular route. Say you also suspect someone who was in the getaway car, and you've got their billing record. In the moments after the bank raid, the suspect's phone makes a series of telephone calls. You look at the billing record and you get details of the cells that were used for that. If you then do a forensic radio survey and drive down the route that you know the getaway car took, you can then look at the recorded results of that survey and look at the sequence of cells that were detected upon that route. And I've used this technique many times, and in lots of occasions, the progression of cells that we detected in the drive survey exactly matches the set of cells that were used by the suspect in their billing record for the sequence of calls that took place, it is alleged, during the getaway journey. There's other scenarios that we've used as well. So walk surveys. I've had people take buses. I've even had someone take a ferry across a river to get details of the coverage on the ferry route. I've had someone cycle down a cycle path with the radio survey equipment running to get details of the coverage along that path as well. So lots of different surveys can be undertaken to prove lots of different types of scenario. Once you've got the ability to go out and take radio surveys, there are several advocates over here in law enforcement who advocate the idea of doing proactive surveys. So you task someone once a week or once a month to take their radio survey equipment and drive around your known crime hotspots or your areas that are likely to be subject to a terrorist incident or something like that. Meaning that if an incident takes place, instead of then having to go out and take a survey reactively, if you've got regular proactive survey results, you can just go back to your most recent set of proactive surveys and say, right, here's the coverage for that location. What cell towers should we be looking for? Lots of organizations also keep, for similar reasons, historical databases of old surveys. So the old surveys they've gone out and done reactively for jobs, they keep in a database, which again can be compared and looked at for jobs in the future. One benefit of having these historical stores of data is that they can be used to rebut one of the key defense points that's made against cell site analysis. One of the key defense points that's made is, okay, so you went out and took some forensic radio surveys, but you took those surveys 6 weeks after the crime happened. How do we know that the radio coverage hasn't changed in that time? How do we know that the cell tower company hasn't come round and pointed the antennas in a different direction or installed a new site or taken sites away? And the answer to that, if you haven't got a historical store of proactive surveys, is, well, we can go and ask the cell tower company if they've done that and just hope that they've got maintenance records that show that kind of activity. So there's lots of benefits of having this historical database. Again, having a historical database of old surveys or regular proactive surveys counters one of the other criticisms that's levelled at cell tower tracking, at cell site analysis, which is that it's impossible to predict what the coverage area of a cell actually is. Now, personally, in my experience, this is nonsense. Cells cover the same area. The edges of that coverage area might fluctuate a little under competition from neighbouring cells, but most cells have a core coverage area that remains the same day after day, week after week, year after year. But being able to prove that is quite difficult. So if you've got a historical store of old surveys, that's one way of providing that proof. You can say, look, here's a survey we took last week, and then last month, and the month before, and the month before that, and 2 years ago, and they all show the same core coverage area for that cell. So that's radio surveys as part of cell site analysis. Let's talk about what we regard as being the best practice. Well, okay, I should roll back on that a bit. What is commonly regarded as being best practice. Like most other disciplines, if you get 5 cell site experts in a room, you'd probably end up with 6 or 7 different opinions as to what best practice was. So a consensus view of best practice is gradually emerging. And it's generally considered that cell site analysis provides supporting evidence rather than being primary evidence of its own. Now, part of the reason for this is the variability, the inexactitude of cell site analysis. As I said earlier on, cells cover a large area. The use of a particular cell by a phone is proof that the phone must have been within the coverage area of that cell when the call was made, but it's very difficult, almost impossible in most cases, to say exactly where within that coverage area the phone must have been when that call was made. So although you can go and take location surveys and say, yes, the evidence supports the contention that the phone was at this location, no cell site expert, except in a very, very limited range of circumstances, would stand up and say, yes, judge, this is the only place that phone could have been. So because of that doubt, that inexact nature, cell site evidence is generally best used when it's supporting other evidence, when it's supporting witness statements, when it's supporting crime scene evidence like DNA, when it's supporting CCTV images, and so on. In those circumstances, it works very well. Supporting evidence backed up by cell site evidence, primary evidence backed up by cell site evidence is generally a very powerful combination. Also, in general, in terms of best practice, there's differences in the, how can I put this, differences in terms of the accuracy that can be gained between different types of cell site data. Now, most cell phone operators will supply one set of billing records for a customer's voice and SMS transactions, and often they would supply a different set of billing records for their data and internet connections, so their cellular data, their GPRS data. Because of the more variable nature of data transactions, so a data session can be set up, but the phone doesn't necessarily actually need to be sending data all the time during the session. Because of some variability related to the billing data itself, it's often considered that voice and SMS gives a much more accurate basis for cell site analysis. So SMS particularly, an SMS text message is sent and received in a fraction of a second. So the cell ID that's captured for that transaction must be the cell that the phone was covered by at that exact instant in time. Voice records that show that a phone set the call up via a particular start cell, again, you can trust that the phone must have been within that cell at the point that that timestamp was captured. For data transactions, GPRS transactions, there's sometimes a bit of variability. You can't necessarily trust that the phone was under the coverage of the cell ID that was captured at the timestamp time captured in the billing record. And I'd be happy to outline the reasons for this if anyone's interested in it, but I don't think we've got time to go into it on tonight's session. Excuse me, just take a sip of my tea to keep my voice working. So, cell site evidence can be primary evidence, but only in a limited set of circumstances. For example, you can say this phone was at this address and nowhere else based on cell site evidence if the phone was using a femtocell. Now, femtocells provide just a few tens of meters or even just 10 meters of coverage around the cell tower itself, and the cell site, the equipment, is about the size of an internet router and is plugged into someone's broadband connection. So if somebody used a femtocell and that femtocell was at their home address, you can say absolutely use of that cell is consistent with being at that address, near that address, and nowhere else. But there's a very limited set of circumstances in which you can be that exact. So the components of cell site analysis that we tend to use are the billing records themselves, the CDRs, the call detail records. Once you've found a set of, once you've narrowed your CDRs down to the calls that you're interested in, you can go back to the cell tower company and say, right, tell me where these cell towers are. So you can get latitude and longitude and details of what direction the antenna is pointing in, and so on. Investigators will also provide details of the events that are under investigation, so the crimes, the dates and times of those events, and also the significant locations, the crime scenes, people's home addresses, and so on. It's normally down to the investigators to get a solid attribution for the cell phone before they commission a cell site analysis report. If you can tie the phone to an individual, then you can tie the cell site to that individual. If you've only got the cell site, but if you've only got the phone, but you can't place it in someone's hand, the cell site evidence is of less compelling value. Finally, we've got the allegations that are made that this person used this cell phone at this location at this time to make this call. So the job of the cell site report is to tie all those bits together. Otherwise, the allegations that have been made. The output of a cell site investigation then are the forensic radio surveys that have been undertaken. And I'm by no means advocating that forensic radio surveys need to be undertaken in all circumstances. There are lots of cases where just a basic knowledge of where the cell tower is enough evidence. It's really the exceptions, the more complicated cases, the difficult ones, the ones where there are alibis to prove and disprove, where the alibi and the offence location are quite close together, maybe in the same city. In those circumstances, forensic radio surveys add an important extra dimension to the report. The report itself provides details and a commentary on the calls that were made and the cells that were used versus the allegations that have been made and the radio survey evidence. So the report tries to tie calls to locations to cells. The call schedules, the call tables, provide generally an easier to follow version of the original raw CDRs, maybe color coded, maybe with notes and comments on, to enable a jury and investigators and the judge to follow the evidence that's being presented. And quite often we also present cell site maps that show the location of the towers in relation to the locations and everything else. Again, in terms of compelling evidence that's going to keep a jury interested, having interactive maps to display to them is one way of stopping them falling asleep during your evidence, which has happened to me a couple of times, I'm embarrassed to say. Not me falling asleep, members of the jury falling asleep. Okay, so what are the differences from our point of view between how we do things over here in Europe and how you guys do things over in the US? We've broken this down into 3 areas: technological, architectural, and procedural. The obvious technological differences are that historically, maybe less so now, and definitely less so in a year or two's time, but historically you've had a much more complicated radio environment than we've got. You've had many more different types of radio system in use by cellular operators than we have in Europe. So you've had your CDMA1 and your CDMA 2000 networks. You've had your IS-95 and your IS-2000 networks. You've had WiMAX, you've had IDEN, you've had all sorts of other technologies that we don't tend to use. In addition, though, you've got more globally deployed technologies as well, such as GSM, UMTS, and LTE, which are the three technologies that we commonly use over in Europe. There are a few CDMA 2000 networks and a few WiMAX networks over here as well, but predominantly we're dealing with GSM, UMTS, or LTE. Historically, again, one of the arguments that's been made against using forensic radio survey techniques in the US has been the lack of equipment available for some of the radio services that need to be surveyed. So it's very cheap and easy to get hold of equipment that measures GSM, UMTS, and LTE networks. There are equipment vendors that produce very adequate equipment, very useful equipment, for as little as £4,000. So what's that, $6,000 or so? Up to really very competent bits of equipment that are over here are on sale for £20,000 or £25,000, but they've got 10 radios in or 20 radios in. So you can do 20 sets of measurements simultaneously with one piece of equipment. It's less easy to get hold of equipment that measures some of the more US only or more limited deployment radio service types, but as many of these radio services are now being closed down in favor of LTE, this is maybe something that's becoming less of a problem for you guys. Architectural differences are mainly to do with the size of the country. The US is a very big country. I hadn't really appreciated quite how big it was until I had to take a flight from Atlanta to Seattle once, and it took me longer to fly from Atlanta to Seattle than it took me to fly from London to Atlanta in the first place. Did it? No, maybe not. Almost as long as it took me to fly from London to New York when I've done that route in the past. Big country, small cells, very difficult, very expensive to reach across the entire continental United States. This means again that cell site analysis isn't something that is universally applicable to all investigations. If you've got an incident that takes place up here somewhere, what's this, Wyoming maybe, where there's no cell coverage at all by the looks of it, or very little outside of the towns, then cell site analysis is going to provide no benefit at all. But in more heavily populated, better served areas, cell site analysis could be as beneficial as it is in a country like the UK, where we've got, well, 90 to 95% cellular coverage. Procedural differences are legion, so there are differences between all jurisdictions, but I think possibly because of the from our point of view anyway, the more complicated federal arrangements that you've got in the US. So you've got federal and state and county authorities. We've heard accounts of there being different rules for the capture of cell site information on a county by county basis, even, at least definitely a state by state basis. So there are differences in the way that you can get hold of the billing information in the first place. We've also heard anecdotally that although forensic radio surveys aren't often undertaken in the US, investigators do try to get that level of information, but they go to the cell site companies and get details of their coverage maps. So they say to the cell site company, where does this cell tower cover? Now, cell site coverage maps from the cell phone companies are generally based on estimates made by their planning system, rather than being based on empirical evidence based on going out and taking measurements. So there's a difference in possibly the accuracy that you might get based on the predictions made by the cell phone company and the actual measurements captured by a radio survey. Okay, that's the background to this then, and some of the techniques and the technologies that are employed. Let me very quickly give you a bit of a flavour of how this technology and how this evidential mechanism gets used over here in the UK. So let's look at some case studies. In general, slightly contradicting what I said previously, but I think I can get out of it. It's not necessarily a bad thing to base your radio coverage estimates on the coverage maps provided by cell phone companies. In lots of examples, again, if all you're trying to do is prove a broad brush contention, this person was in this part of the city, that kind of cellular provider map is perfectly adequate. Location surveys, going out and taking radio surveys, again, is something that's necessary for the exceptions. So things that require further analysis, further investigation, further empirical proof beyond what you can get from a more broad brush approach. And one of the reasons for this is that radio is a very dynamic environment. Radio signals fluctuate over time. Radio signals from different transmitters compete with each other. Radio signals can be blocked by big hills and mountains or large buildings. So the radio environment itself is constantly changing. There are predictable areas of coverage for each cell, but out on the edges of that coverage, these fluctuations lead to some uncertainty over time, which again is a good reason for going out and taking actual measurements at a location. So our first case study is one of my old cases, actually. And just to highlight the benefit that adding forensic radio surveys to a case can bring. In this particular case, it was a stabbing. So a guy got stabbed in a nightclub in London, particularly in part of South London called Streatham. Now, they know that this guy was there because he was caught on CCTV going into the club about 5 minutes before the stabbing occurred. And they had witnesses and lots of other things as well. So they didn't really need the cell site evidence to place the guy at the nightclub. But after the stabbing, he drove away and deposited the knife and some bloody clothes and some other evidence that implicated some other accomplices. And the cell tower, the cell site analysis data, followed his car's route as he drove to this deposition site. So the phone evidence itself was useful for this second part of the case. It wasn't necessarily the primary evidence against him being the stabber. However, when we looked at the cell phone evidence for this phone, the guy's phone had made a bunch of calls in Streatham using cell towers around the... About 2 minutes before the stabbing occurred, according to his billing record, his phone was using a cell tower all the way over in North London, on top of the Science Museum, actually, just north of central London. Now, this is only 5 miles away, but central London is incredibly dense for cell coverage. So there were tens or dozens or hundreds even of cell towers in between these 2 points. So it was almost inconceivable that a phone at this location would have used a cell tower all the way over here. And on that basis, the defense in this case were pressing for the phone evidence to be excluded, as they were saying it was an impossible call. So therefore, the phone data must be corrupt or unreliable. Now, we did a couple of things. After scratching our heads for a while and thinking, well, this is an impossible call, so the phone data must be wrong, we tried a couple of things first. Firstly, we went back to the phone company and we asked them to provide what's called a path profile. Now, this shows the geographical contour heights along a slice of territory. So along this particular line, they showed us the land profile between those 2 points, and we realized what we should have guessed to begin with, that because of the River Thames running through the middle of London, London's in a valley, and the nightclub in Streatham was up on one edge of this valley, and the cell site on top of the Science Museum, clicked when I shouldn't have clicked, was up on the other lip of this valley, and the cell tower was beaming clear line of sight right across the top of central London over to here. Now, we also sent a guy into the nightclub when it was closed, with permission, but we sent our forensic radio surveyor into the nightclub with the survey equipment, and he wandered around inside the club, and upstairs in the club, next to a window that was facing northeast, he found a patch of serving coverage from that cell. And it just so happened it was about 15 feet away from where the guy had been stabbed in the club. So we proved, using a forensic radio survey, that the phone calls could have been made from that location. So we proved it wasn't an impossible call, which meant that we managed to keep the cell phone evidence in the case. So we not only got the guy for the stabbing, we also got his accomplices based on the evidence related to the drive to the knife deposition site. So the guy that got stabbed, and apart from the guy that went to prison for 10 years. So that's one example. The second case, although this should be case 2, sorry, I've obviously made a typo there, but case 2, now this is quite a notorious case over here in the UK. About 15 years ago, 2 young girls went missing from a town in England called Soham. Hollywells and Jessica Simpson, I think her name was. Well, Holly and Jessica, anyway. Very famous in the UK. There was a huge manhunt for them. It took weeks. The police eventually found bodies and they'd been killed. But they found them and they got their suspect partly based on radio survey evidence. Now, one of the girls, Holly or Jessica, just before they disappeared, had sent a text message to her mum. And the cell that her phone used to send the text message was located off the edge of this map, up here, covering the next village. Burwell, I think the village was called. So the investigators, when they were searching for the girls while they were still missing, went to the phone company and got their predicted coverage map for that Burwell cell, which provided, as expected, lots of contiguous coverage around that village and little spots of coverage elsewhere further away. But you can see there's a spot of coverage here, there's a bit of coverage here, but very little coverage at all in Soham itself. So the police focused their search elsewhere. Now, after a while, it became apparent that they weren't getting anywhere, so they commissioned a forensic radio survey of that cell. And the forensic radio survey threw up some extra areas of coverage, one of which was just here, which the police found significant, because this was right outside the house of someone who'd been making himself known to the investigation. He was actually the caretaker, the custodian of the school that the girls went to, and he had been present throughout the investigation, asking if he could help, offering to help search, asking if there was any updates. And the police found it significant that this patch of coverage that the girls' phone had used was outside his house. So they got a search warrant, searched his house, found DNA from the girls in an upstairs room, and therefore found their murderer. At the same time, a bit later on, they found the bodies where the guy had dumped them after he'd killed them, but they probably would have got to him eventually. Once they started digging into it, this guy had a very unsavory history, and they probably would have got to him eventually anyway. But undertaking this forensic radio survey that threw up this entirely unexpected area of coverage from the cell that was used got them to him a lot quicker. Didn't get them to him soon enough to get the girls before they were killed, unfortunately, but at least they got their man in the end. The third case, unfortunately, all of these cases involve unpleasant events, but then I guess a lot of law enforcement activity does. In this particular case, there was a murder that took place in a different part of London, called Battersea, in central London. And this is one of my colleague Martin's cases. And in this case, there was evidence that the car used by the murderer had driven along a particular street. They had a suspect, and the suspect's alibi was that at the time the murder occurred, he was in the area, but he was driving along a street over here. So he was driving down this street over here, for example, where the police allege murderer's car actually drove along this street here, which is just here on this other map. So what we've got here is two coverage surveys of two different cells in that same area. Significantly, a call that took place just before the murder occurred started on this cell and ended on this cell. And the call only lasted for a few seconds, 15 or 20 seconds. So we were looking for an area that was covered by both cells. Now you can see this particular cell covers virtually nowhere, so there's no point really the phone company having paid all the money to install it. Most of this area is covered by this blue cell here, and there are very small areas where there's potential overlap between the two cells. One of those areas is along this road here. So it's perfectly possible, based on this evidence, for the call to have started on this cell, going along this street, and ended along on this cell on a different part of that same street. It's also perfectly clear from this evidence that neither cell serves on the road that the guy was putting forward as his alibi location. So again, the forensic radio survey that was undertaken provided additional compelling evidence to support the witness statements that had shown the suspect's car driving along that street. So some reasonably fast skips through some significant cases of ours, and historical ones as well. I hope that's thrown some light maybe on the benefit that these additional techniques can bring to cell site cases. Let's very quickly wrap up now. We'll look at the biggest challenge to cell sites. I'll quickly mention our software and our training resources, and then we'll call it a night, because it's almost midnight here in the UK, and I can hear my bed calling me. So let's talk about the biggest challenge. For most organizations, most law enforcement and external cell site expert, cell site analysis organizations, the biggest problem is dealing with the data itself. Phone records are huge spreadsheets full of data. All different phone companies use all different formats. So if you've got a case that involves phones from different phone companies, for an analyst to process the data into a common format before they can start analyzing it. And this can be very time consuming and extremely inefficient. And I know this because I've done it, manually bashing call data through Excel spreadsheets to try and knock them into the same common format. Because of this, Martin, my colleague, and I, a couple of years ago, decided there's got to be a better way in the 21st century for dealing with this situation. So we started a new company, and our company produces CSAS, the Cell Site Analysis Suite, which is a software application that automates the process of normalizing call data. So we've taught CSAS to understand all of the UK billing formats and formats from a number of other places as well. And we can easily integrate billing formats from new countries as we begin to roll services out there. So what CSAS does in seconds is to automate the job that would take a manual analyst hours or days of work. CSAS normalizes call data at a rate of about 1,000 calls a second. And we've seen experienced analysts almost break down in tears when they see how fast it works, how much time they could save out of their daily routine that they could actually spend analyzing the data and adding value to their cases. CSAS also has a mapping component, so we cleanse and normalize the data. We've got some analytical functions as well that provide standard analytical outputs on the data. We can incorporate RF survey results into it, so you can have queries that match the call data plus the RF survey data. And we've got a mapping application as well, which automatically populates maps with cell site locations and sector azimuths and things like that. So that's primarily what we're focused on these days. Martin is still an active expert witness. I stopped doing it a couple of years ago because I found that I've got a young family, and getting dragged to court at short notice unexpectedly just wasn't compatible with doing the school run and picking the children up. So Martin still does it because his children are older than mine. We've also got a book out, as Nathan mentioned earlier. It's got my name on the cover, but it's more of a collective effort by the whole company. And what we've tried to do is to distill everything we covered at the start of this webinar that talks about how the networks work and how the technology works into the first half of the book in, we hope, an accessible and easy to understand way. Then the second half of the book summarizes the second half of the webinar, in that we try to explain forensic radio surveys, the techniques that are used, the benefits that we gain from it, and then further we explain how that then feeds into cell site analysis cases, and how we produce reports and how we present this stuff in evidence at court. So if you're interested, as Nathan said, it's on Amazon. The publishers have had to reprint because they sold out, but they've got more stock going in now, I believe. We also have a set of training resources available, which in the US we're going to offer through ANRC. So if you look at our website, or look at ANRC's website, you can get full details of the training that we offer. We are going to begin offering some training courses in the US in the spring. So we'll be offering a cell site analysis basics course, but we'll also be offering RF survey workshops for those that are already familiar with a cell site but want to explore this idea of forensic radio surveying in more detail. So if you're interested in any of these, please by all means contact us or contact ANRC direct, and we'll provide you with details. So that's it. That's everything that I wanted to talk about tonight. So I hope that what we've covered, for those of you that weren't previously familiar with cell site analysis, hopefully I've explained it in a way that has made sense, and you can begin to appreciate the benefit of this kind of evidential technique. For those of you that are already experienced practitioners but maybe haven't explored the idea of forensic radio surveys before, hopefully I've given you some idea of why we think this is an important and beneficial adjunct to cell site analysis. We have a feedback function that Nathan's going to tell you about now, but I'll hand you back to Nathan. Thank you this evening, and hopefully we'll see you again at some point when we start running courses over in the US. So thanks very much, and Nathan, back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Joe. I thought that was excellent information. I did have one question that came up right here at the end, so if you wouldn't mind handling one. One of the questions was, how are you going to handle VOLTE?
VLLTE.
Oh, is that okay?
Was that Nathan?
Well, it looks like VoLTE. I'm not real sure.
Oh, VoLTE. Okay, sorry. Yeah, apologies. Okay, yeah, VoLTE, voice over LTE. Okay, LTE 4G networks are all IP networks, so it's all data, which means it can't handle voice in the traditional way. So the two ways in which voice can be handled in LTE networks are either to do CS fallback, which makes the phone fall back to a legacy network, either a CDMA network or a GSM network, and make the call there, or use VoLTE, which uses voice over IP techniques to carry the call across the IP bearers created in the LTE network. Now, VoLTE uses the PS, the packet switched IP network, but there are enhancements that are added to the network. So going back to what I was saying earlier on about the unreliability of data records, the fact that VoLTE gets added to this is going to, we expect anyway, I've not seen examples of the call records yet, but what we expect to happen is that this will add some additional rigor to the production of those data related call records. So you will get timestamps that relate to the start of a call. You will get itemized billing related to the individual calls made across the VoLTE network. And once that happens, you will be able to tie more accurately the cell tower that was used to the timestamp of the call. So our expectation, our firm expectation, is that Volte should give us a similar degree of itemized billing that traditional circuit switch networks give us, and they should give us additional rigor in the billing process itself to mean that we can trust the cell IDs presented in the Volte related data records. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it did. Yeah, he said thank you. So there you go.
Oh, good. It must have done then. Happy to help.
Yeah. We'll let you get to bed. Thank you very much, Joe. So thank you for attending our webinar this evening, everyone. We hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. Again, I'll be emailing you all the links to the slides and the recorded broadcast as soon as I can get it up on YouTube. And we ask that you fill out a 3-question short survey at the end once we close out here. So thanks for your time and enjoy the rest of your day. We hope we can help you out in the future. Take care.